I mean, he takes every opportunity he can get to harass us, tease us, drive me within an inch of my sanity. He's very good at that. Anyways, he stopped me on my way out. He said, Elizabeth, wait. Now, did I hear you say that you're going on a trip with your friend? And I said, yeah, I'm so excited, I can't wait. And he said, well, did you say you're going on a trip to Beaver, Utah? Elizabeth, I thought you had better taste than that. I mean, why would you ever go on a trip to Beaver, Utah? Now, if there's anyone here from Beaver, Utah, I am not trying to offend you. I'm very sorry. I'm sure it's a lovely place. I'm just telling you how it happened. Because there's always one person that comes up to me afterwards and says, I grew up in Beaver, or my grandparents lived there, or we have a family reunion there. So I'm sure it's a great place. I have no doubts. But anyways, back to what happened. My brother, he just kept on saying, Elizabeth, come on, it's Beaver, Utah, like really? And I remember just turning to him and saying, Charles, you're just jealous because you're not going. And he said, well, just answer me this, because I think I know the answer. What exactly are you going to be doing while you're in Beaver, Utah? And I said, well, I don't know, actually. I don't know what we'll be doing. He said, that's exactly what I thought. You don't know what you're going to be doing because there's nothing to do. And I said, well, Charles, maybe there's nothing to do in Beaver, Utah, but at least I will be away from you. And he just did what big brothers do, just kind of smiled, continued teasing, and I turned around and walked up to my room, and I was right about to walk inside my room when I stopped and I said, Charles, what if that was the last thing you ever said to me? And he just kind of looked at me and smiled, turned around and walked off to his room. And I remember walking into my room and crawling in bed next to my younger sister and falling asleep. Well, the next voice that I heard definitely was anything but my older brother's voice. I had never heard this voice before in my entire life. And I couldn't believe it. At first, I thought that this had to be part of a dream. I thought, this is not real, this couldn't possibly be happening. This just has to be part of my imagination. Well, it wasn't. The voice repeated again, saying, I have a knife at your neck, don't make a sound, get up and come with me. And as I lay there, I could feel a knife lying across my neck. And I could feel someone's hand on my arm trying to pull me out of bed. I couldn't believe it was real. But when the connection finally was made in my brain that it was, I had never been so scared in my entire life. I had never had that amount of adrenaline running through my body as I did in that moment. I remember immediately getting up out of bed and doing exactly as this man said, because I didn't know if he'd been through my house already, if he'd killed my parents, if he'd killed my brothers. But the one thing that I did know was that my younger sister was still asleep in bed next to me, and she was still alive. And I didn't want anything to happen to her. And I remember as he led me out through my house, I remember just thinking, wait a second, this cannot be real. Surely, if my parents are alive, they'll wake up they'll stop this from happening. They'll protect me. And my house at the time, every time you opened a door, beeped. It had an alarm, a security system set up. And I remember as he brought me toward the back kitchen door, he opened the door and the alarm didn't go off. Well, later we found out that the little magnets that controlled the beeping had fallen out of the door. And so that's why it never beeped. He brought me up through my backyard. And for those of you who have not been to Salt Lake, the city is in a valley and it's surrounded by mountains, and the house that I grew up in sits up on one of the sides of the mountains, and our backyard is unfenced, and so you really can go straight from my house just into the wilds of the mountains. And it's a matter of minutes, really. Anyways, he took me up through my backyard, and there's one more residential street between my backyard and, well, nothing, just mountain. And as we came up to the street, all of a sudden he pushed me down behind some bushes, and I didn't know why. I had no idea. But I remember I was able to lift my head up just high enough to see over the very top of these bushes, and I saw some headlights coming down the street, and they came closer and closer and closer and closer, and pretty soon they passed right in front of us, and as it passed in front of us, I read the word police written along the side of the car, and for a second I thought, yes, they know, they're here to rescue me, it's gonna be okay. This is just gonna turn into a bad dream. Well, the police car didn't stop. It just kept going, and as soon as it was around the curve, this man grabbed hold of me again, yanked me up off the ground, and had me run as fast as I could across the street. And we started heading up into the mountains. Well, Utah is quite an outdoorsy place. There's lots of hiking and biking and lots of outdoor recreation, and so there are many trails through the Utah mountains. And at first we started on a trail, actually one that I knew very well. My dad had taken me hiking on it many times. And there's this point in the trail that it goes up a little ravine and then it turns around and comes back down the other side. Well, this time, instead of turning around and going back down the other side, this man had pushed me off the trail and told me to keep heading straight up into these mountains. Well, the brush got so thick that I couldn't stand up and walk through it. I had to get on my hands and knees and crawl through it. The whole time he was right behind me, holding on to me. He still had his knife on me. And I remember the farther and farther we got away from my home, the more and more I began to think about stories I'd seen in the news. Now, that's not... I did not watch the news a whole lot as a 14-year-old, if we're being honest with one another. I just didn't. But the few times that I had watched the news and these kinds of stories, kidnapping stories had come on, they always tended to be the same kind of story. A child disappeared, a search was put on, maybe it was a day later, maybe it was months or years later, but eventually the body was found, and that was just it. It was always the body. They never came back alive. The body was found. They could tell from the remains that this child had been raped, this child had been beaten, this child had ultimately been murdered. And that's exactly what I thought was going to happen to me. I thought I was going to be raped, and then I thought I was going to be murdered. So the farther and farther we got away from my home, the more and more scared I became that if this happened, my parents wouldn't find my remains, and they would never know what happened to me. They would maybe think that I ran away, or that I was trying to rebel, but when in fact, if we were all different flavors of ice cream, I would have been vanilla. In fact, I still probably would be vanilla. No sprinkles, no hot fudge, just plain vanilla. That's just me. I don't know what else to tell you. Anyways, I wanted my parents to find my remains. I wanted them to know what happened to me. And so I stopped my counter for a minute and I said, well, if you're just going to rape and kill me, could you please Could you please do it here? Well, he stopped and he looked at me and he kind of smiled and he said, oh, I'm not going to rape and kill you yet. And then we kept on going and we went further and further and further, and I stopped him again and I said, well, don't you realize what you're doing? I mean, if you get caught, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. But I promise, if you let me go, my family won't press charges. Just let me go right here. I can get back to my house, and it'll be like none of this ever happened. Please, just let me go. He stopped and looked at me and smiled again, and he said, I know exactly what I'm doing. The only difference is, I'm not going to get caught. And then we continued on. And we went so far up into these mountains that we crossed right over the top of the mountain, and we started down the other side. And at this point, the sun had just barely come up, just barely peeked over the mountains. And when we started down the other side, I was so scared and so worried. He wasn't gonna let me go. What was he planning on doing with me? He said he was gonna rape and murder me, but then he said yet. So clearly he had some kind of plans in the future, but what was going to happen? And I remember we were about a quarter of the way down the mountain, still quite close to the top, but far enough that if some really, really adventurous hiker who was hiking ridge lines wouldn't venture down this far. And we came to a grove of trees, which, shock horror, is not that uncommon in the mountains. You pass trees all the time. And this girl looked just like every other grouping of trees we passed along the way. But this time, instead of walking by, he stopped and he pushed me into the center of the grove of trees, told me to go in. And I remember I walked into the center of this grove of trees, and there I saw that part of the mountain had been leveled out, and there was a tent set up, and there were tarps that were laid out on the ground, and then there were some tarps hanging up in the trees, creating a shade. And I remember seeing this great big hole that had been dug out of the side of the mountain, and then there were these big logs laid across the top of the hole, and all the dirt that had been dug out had then been thrown back up on top of these logs. And then I remember seeing this skinny piece of metal cable, and it was wrapped around a tree on one end of the camp, ran through the middle of the camp, and wrapped around another tree on the other end of the camp. It wasn't very long, but I did remember seeing it, and I had no idea what it was for at that time, because the scariest thing that I saw, the most noticeable thing that I saw at this camp, was the woman that walked out of the tent. She looked unlike any woman I have ever seen. She had long hair, and she had on long robes, and she had on this strange sort of headdress, and it wasn't her clothes or her hair or her, I don't know, lack of personal hygiene so much that made her unlike anybody else I'd ever seen. I couldn't really tell you what it was, other than saying there was just something about her that when you looked at her, gave you the shivers. I mean, there's just something not nice about her. And the first thing she did when she saw me was she came up to me and she gave me this big hug, and it wasn't like, it's gonna be okay kind of hug.